Okay, well, so once again, welcome everyone. Today is Sabbath, January 30th, 2021. And today we're going to look at part two of a Bible study that I started a couple of weeks ago called Women in the Bible, A Closer Look. Now, let me just preface the study with a few statements. And I said some of this last time, but many of you were not present. So I want to just kind of repeat a few things. First, this is a tough study. It was a tough study for me to prepare, and it's a little bit tough for me to deliver. And for some of you, it's a little tougher than some of the basic things for you even to hear, because some of the things that I'm going to be talking about may be a little controversial in terms of my interpretations of certain things. And I want to just kind of reassure you, right? And how do I want to reassure you? By first of all saying that the interpretations I'm presenting to you are exactly that, interpretations, okay? So I don't want anyone leaving here thinking, well, Carlos said this is the exact way that this is interpreted, or this verse is interpreted this way, or that verse is interpreted. No, these are possible interpretations. The kind of verses that we're looking at, especially when it comes to women in the Bible, are for a number of reasons, including and especially because of language and culture, they're not easy to interpret. I mean, seasoned scholars of Greek and Hebrew, right? People who have been studying these things for years have trouble interpreting these verses, right? And that's not because they're unintelligent. It's not because they're, not motivated or they don't apply themselves. It's because there are cultural and language differences that make these passages notoriously difficult to translate and to understand in their proper context. And then when you couple that with the fact that when you're dealing with any issues dealing with gender, oh my goodness, you're talking about explosive potential interpretations, right? Because they affect all of us in a very deep and personal way, right? So please understand that I'm not trying to overturn, for lack of a better term, orthodoxy today. And I'm not trying to, create all kinds of new teachings or whatever, but I do want to do one thing, and which is the reason why I even decided to tackle this study, is that I want to dispel the notion that there's only one way to interpret or read a text, and that when you look at things in such a way that you're looking at things that's either black or white with nothing in between, you exclude the possibility of meanings and interpretations of the text that could be very important and that could be causing more harm than good. Okay. Particularly in our day and age, I've never been one to shy away from the tough issues. As many of you know, dealing with me for years, and during the Feast of Tabernacles, for example, going over topics dealing with apologetics or with gender issues or sexual orientation or any number of contemporary issues. I believe it's important for us to understand these things so that we can have a better viewpoint, and so that we don't have tunnel vision, so that we understand the complexities of Scripture, and especially the complexities of taking passages that were written literally thousands of years ago and trying to make sense of them in the present context in modern times. So I'm saying all this not to hedge my bets, right? But I want you to really understand that I don't expect you to come away from here convinced that what I'm saying is right. I don't expect you to leave here saying, oh my goodness, he's going off the deep end. I want to be very clear about everything so that we can look at these things in a way that, we all leave saying, oh, that's interesting. I never thought of it that way. Right? All right. So with that in mind, I don't want to give a whole lot of recap from last time because it was a lot of material. And you could always go back and I'll put out the video so that you can see that. But I do want to give you a little bit of context, especially for those of you who were not here last time, because it is important. And one of the main points that I made was that from the very beginning, the scriptures established the tone with regard to how it describes the role of men and women. So let me say what I believe the scripture clearly says. I believe the scripture clearly indicates that men and women are different and distinct. I know that that's not a fashionable idea in the present day, where there are many attempts to blur the distinction between men and women. I do not agree with that. And we could study some of those things another time. But the scriptures clearly describe that Yahweh made male and he made female. Okay. And another thing the scriptures teaches is that male and female are equal. Period. End of discussion. Male and female are equal. How do I know that? Because he tells us. So if you go back to Genesis 1, and this is foundational, so we will go and repeat this. In Genesis 1:26, Yahweh is culminating what in effect throughout all of Genesis 1, which is describing creation, what is describing is a metaphorical construction of a temple. The last thing that you put in the temple is the image. Now, as we all know, there is no image that represents Yahweh per se, but the closest that comes to it is the one who was created in his image, which is man. So man as an image is meant to reflect to the rest of the world who Yahweh is, which is why there's such a heavy emphasis and burden upon us to do what's right in the sight of Yahweh so that we could represent him well. Adam was meant to do that. Adam failed to adequately represent Yahweh's image because of his fall. And when I say Adam, by the way, I'm not just referring to that male personage known as Adam. I'm referring to Adam and Eve, who together constitute man, Adam. What do I mean by that? Well, Genesis 1, verse 26, then Elohim said, let us, speaking of himself and his son, Elohim said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. There it is. I'm going to make an image bearer to show our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals. Notice, so that they, plural, may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So Elohim created mankind, or man, in his own image, whereas all the other animals, all the other species, the birds of the air, the beasts of the field, and everything else that moves upon the face of the earth and under the earth and the seas, etc., whereas all those things were created according to their kind. The beasts were made according to their kind. The birds were made according to their kind. Only man was made according to the Elohim kind, was made according to the image of Elohim. Only man. He's distinct of all creation because he is the image bearer of Yahweh. So Elohim created mankind in his own image. In the image of Elohim, he created them, plural, male and female, he created them. So man, Adam, man is male and female, two distinct entities, both of which constitute mankind or man, okay? And that's where the equality comes into play. Elohim blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. And then he goes on, he says some other things. Now, if you hold your place there, and we all know that from man, Yahweh creates, from Adam, the personage Adam, he creates Eve from the rib. An intimacy that's there, they're one made from the other, right? Flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone. They're of the same essence, if you will. Then you look over in Genesis 5, and then it says, this is the written account. This is Genesis 5:1. This is the written account of Adam's family line. When Elohim created mankind, Adam, he made them, there it is again, them, in the likeness of Elohim, in his image. He created them male and female and blessed them. And he named them mankind, and the word is Adam, when they were created. When Adam had lived, and all of a sudden in verse 3, we see Adam again, but now the context is clearly showing that that Adam that's being described there is the male of the overall mankind. So he's referred to as Adam, you have to be careful of that. You don't necessarily see that in the in the English text unless it's translated like it is here, right? Because there's a personage named Adam who is the male of the mankind, and then there's the collective Adam, which is male and female. Okay, so I point all that out because there's confusion about that, and because of the gender politics of literally thousands of years, these things tend to get blurred, and then women are shortchanged in the process, typically, right? Because there's this macho image of the male in charge, which is another issue altogether, which we'll get to when we start looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Okay, but then when you look at the very beginning of creation, Adam and Eve were created as supplemental elements of one another, neither of which could exist on their own. That's why Eve was created, because it was not good for man to be alone. He needed a help meet for him, an ezer kenegdo, which means a helper that is a fitting helper, someone who is suitable for him. In other words, it literally means a helper corresponding to him. So if you think about, and I don't usually like to mix religious ideas, but if you think about because there's always elements of truth, and because all religion ultimately, I believe, is traced back to the beginning, right? And it just became corrupted along different elements. So you look at something like in Eastern teachings of the yin and the yang, right? You don't have one without the other. And it's kind of like what we're looking at here. You have male and female, both of which correspond to one another, and both of which complete one another. Okay. Now, it's important to understand that, because when we're looking at the issue of men and women, particularly in the present day, and really since the time of Yahshua forward, there's something happening that we need to understand. You've heard me refer several times to this concept of new creation, right? And I don't just pull that out of thin air. When I'm looking at that, I'm looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 5, among other places, okay? So if you turn with me to 2 Corinthians 5, beginning with verse 16, Paul is talking to the Corinthian assembly about how we are different, how we are renewed in Yahshua Messiah. So he says, so from now on, 2 Corinthians 5:16, so from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view, though we once regarded Messiah in this way. We do so no longer. And that's a reference to having viewed Messiah with a certain view in mind of this big conquering hero that was going to come. And that's not how he came at all. He overturned expectations in the way that he came as king. So he says, though we once regarded Messiah in this way, we do so no longer. Therefore, so immediately we see, before I even read verse 17, immediately we see that Paul is teaching in a way that is overturning expectations, which is following his master, because Yahshua did exactly the same thing. When Yahshua talked about the kingdom of Yahweh, it overturned all expectations about the kingdom. So the disciples came, and the disciples said, hey, when you come into your kingdom, let one of us sit on your right hand and one on your left, and we're going to rule together with you. Right? Yahshua says, the nations of the world think that way. The Gentiles think that way. That's not how we do things. And I'm paraphrasing, right? He said, this is what the kingdom looks like, right? And then when you look at a place like Matthew 13, where he goes through the parables and he says, the kingdom of Yahweh is like, and then a couple of verses later, the kingdom of Yahweh is like, and then the kingdom of Yahweh is like, over and over again. Why? Because he's overturning expectations. Then you look at the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew 5-7, and he describes with the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, etc., right? Blessed are the hungry because they'll be fed, and on and on. He's describing how different the kingdom is going to be from what we see in the world up to this point, right? Because the world doesn't have it right, because it is a corruption of what was intended to be. So Yahshua's purpose was to initiate new creation. And it is embodied in the greatest thing, which is the resurrection itself. The prime example of new creation is the resurrection, which resulted in literally a new creation. Yahshua in a renewed, glorified body, in a new glorified state, that is the heritage for all in Yahshua, which is what he's describing here. We won't read through all of that. As a matter of fact, he had just said that in the previous, in some of the previous verses. But I want to point to that concept of new creation because it's so important, because he's overturning expectations. This is what people think everything's going to be like, but they got it all wrong. We, the servants of Yahweh, know what is the real deal. And that's what we're teaching and what we're describing to you, right? Therefore, if anyone, verse 17, if anyone is in Messiah, the new creation has come, because he's the embodiment of new creation. He's the start of that new creation. And in the same way that he overturned expectations about what the kingdom was like. So people see a king coming with great power and violence and authority, and Yahshua says, no. The king is coming gentle, riding on a donkey, not on a charger for war, right? As one example. And so it is with male and female. He is also overturning expectations. So people culturally, traditionally, they'd always viewed, this is what men do, this is what women do, and never the twain shall meet. And he's saying, no, that's not the way this works. We'll come back to that. Therefore, if anyone was in Messiah, the new creation has come. And by the way, the Greek is interesting there, because it basically says, therefore, if anyone's in Messiah, new creation, right? That's your example. The old has gone, the new is here. And then he goes on from there. Now, go over to Galatians 3. And we'll start reading with verse 26. So in Messiah Yahshua, you are all children of Yahweh through faith. For all of you who are baptized into Messiah have clothed yourself with Messiah. And he's describing what new creation looks like in terms of relationships and people. There's neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female. And that male and female is a direct reference to what you see in Genesis. Is he saying that, okay, well, now there are no more distinctions, right? And there's no such thing as male being male and female? No. That's not what he's saying at all. What he's saying is that under this new system, for you are all one in Messiah Yahshua, there's no distinction the way that this world tries to put barriers between male and female. Male and female are equal in Yahweh's sight. That's the way it always has been. So new creation, in effect, is a restoration of the old creation, but better. It's what it was intended to be and better. So if we got a body from Yahweh that he created when we were created, the resurrected body is everything that our body was and better, without sickness, without disease, capable of doing things that are even better. People have a vision of, in the religious world, particularly, in the way that people view the afterlife, and they think of going to heaven, for example. And they think, okay, well, okay, you go to heaven, but then this kind of an immature view of what going to heaven looks like. And then people think, oh, you're just kind of sitting around in clouds all day. You just gotta, what is there to do? They're very immature ways of looking at things. That's not what the scriptures described about what's to come at all. What the scripture describes, first of all, is not, and this is a study for another day, is not going to a heaven out there. It's essentially a reunification of heaven and earth. That's why you see the New Jerusalem in the book of Revelation coming down out of heaven, and that's symbolically coming down. It's really what's being described is a I guess in our modern day terms, a dimensional thing that's going on, where there's an obliteration of the separation and dimensions between Yahweh's heaven and earth. And essentially we have a return to the Edenic state where Yahweh would meet intimately with mankind. Just like he walked with Adam in the garden in the beginning, it's going to be like that again. Okay. So when you see this new creation being described, it's a restoration. Oh, so the point I was going to make was that kingdom is going to be so much better than anything we've ever imagined, right? It's going to be the beauties of the earth. If you think of all the beauties of the earth and the things that you can enjoy, and you think about that intensified to its fullest, that is a glimpse of what that kingdom is supposed to be like. Why? Because it's new creation. It's everything the earth was intended to be, in intimacy between man and Yahweh, and then some, right? So this idea of turning the thing upside the head, it's important to keep that in mind, because a lot of the controversy that we have with regard to the role of men and women is because I think we fail to understand that if we look at things through older paradigms, through cultural paradigms of what men were supposed to be like and what women were supposed to be like, I think that we miss out and we don't understand the full impact of what new creation is supposed to be about. So let's start going into some different aspects of these verses, right? So some of the things that I pointed out last time was that the message, if women did not have an important role with regard to leadership in the assembly, right? Then why is it that the message of the resurrection was first reported? Can anyone think of any message that would be more important in the history of mankind than the resurrection of Yahshua? I mean, the resurrection of a dead person to life again and to a glorified body at that. You know, I can't even, my mind can't even get around that concept, except in the way that the scripture describes it to me. So in my mind, that is the most, hands down, the most important event that has ever occurred in the history of mankind. That changed everything, that reintroduced the new creation, right? Or that initiated, let's put it that way better, not reintroduced, but that initiated new creation. And that message was so important that it's witnessed first by whom? By women. Is that insignificant, or do we just gloss over that and pass that on the side? And I'm not going to go read all the passages, but you look at Matthew 28, if you're taking notes, Matthew 28, Mark 16, Luke 24, John 20. These are all various accounts by women, by the evangels, the gospels. And in each one of them, the resurrection is first reported by women. And by the way, reported by women in a day and a culture in which the witness of women was not considered legally reliable. Why would you do that? I always kind of laugh when, for a number of reasons, not just because of this, but when people want to downplay the message of the Gospels, and and they want to talk about how this message was fake, and and people were sitting there with the Hebrew scriptures and making up stuff, right? And almost like you were writing a screenplay, just making up stuff and making it match the Old Testament. I think, first of all, you couldn't concoct a conspiracy that well put together, all right? When you look at the texts and how they work together, written over hundreds of years, you couldn't concoct a conspiracy that perfect, right? But even if you could, why would you have, if you're going to do that, if you're going to put out a fake message, why would you have women witness the resurrection? And then it seems to me that in that kind of a culture, the very last thing you're going to do to get people to believe you is by doing something so outlandish and out of the ordinary that they're going to look at it and say, well, that's the horror. In other words, why would they say that? First of all, it's not like you can easily get people to accept the message of a resurrection anyway, right? You look at the book of Acts 17, Paul before the Athenians, and some of them looked at him and said, you're out to lunch, right? Talking about the resurrection. So it's already a tough sell. Why are you going to make it even tougher now by putting the initial witness of the main resurrection of Yahshua, putting it in the hands of women who were not even considered legally reliable as compared to a man in a court of law? Something to think about, not a light thing. I talked about Acts 16 and Lydia, who was a businesswoman, and you have many examples in the scriptures in the New Testament of women who were in prominent positions. Lydia was the leader of the Philippian assembly, right? So if you go out to the book of Acts, let's turn there to Acts 16. And we'll start with verse. Remember that the Philippi was the first assembly that was established in Europe, right? It was in Macedonia, which is just north of Greece, right? So you go to verse 11, Acts 16:11. From Troas, we put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace. And the next day we went out to Neapolis. From there we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony and the leading city of that district of Macedonia, and we stayed there several days. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river, and notice, by the way, that it was on the Sabbath, where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the congregation, the assembly, to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of Yahweh. Yahweh opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. If you consider me a believer in Yahweh, she said, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us. So if there was a larger assembly there, we're not told that. If there were men in the presence of that assembly, somehow Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, decided to leave it out. Not a very logical thing to do if he's looking for credibility in that culture, right? Then we had talking about Lydia, mentions her household. If she was married, doesn't mention it. That's the funny thing to omit. Anywhere you look in there, there's not a mention of a single man. They sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. Now, granted, this was not an assembly yet. This is, but this was the kernel, the nucleus of what eventually became the assembly at Philippi, with which, by the way, Paul had an amazing relationship as you look at the book of Philippians and see that. So my point is that already in just a few places, you're starting to see a role for women that is much greater than you would expect, especially in the ancient world. I skipped over passage after passage in the Gospels, right, in the Evangels, where women are found. Miriam, Yahshua's mother, Mary Magdalene, right? Anna the prophetess, right, which I did mention last time, and several other places where you could go. So women were already, there was something happening here, right, which was much more prominent. And I even pointed out examples in the Old Testament of women in different leadership roles, etc. But it's of a different quality in the Old Testament for some reason than it is here in the New Testament. There's something here that's with every word in the New Testament, there's something that is being brought out in a very powerful way. New Testament is very small. When you look at it, 23 books, very small by comparison to some other major works, not just the Bible, right? Not just the Old Testament scriptures, the Tanakh, but also just of ancient literary writings. So the economy with which you wrote those things, you want to put the most important things in there that are going to convey the message that you want to convey. So is it a coincidence that some of the most important things that I mentioned there are the role, or show the role of women in the early assembly? Seems like wasted space if it wasn't something that was important, and if you weren't trying to send a deliberate message. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to overblow this or overstate it, right? I'm not trying to say that was the primary reason for Paul doing this or whatever, but it is not usual, in my opinion, to use relatively small space. It is not usual to put things in there for credibility that would not make sense in that ancient context. So to me, that tells me something important. One of the things I always tell people when we're studying the scriptures is that one of the ways that you can know that something is important in a particular Bible book or in the scriptures in general is how many times that word appears in the scriptures, right? So if you look at the name of Yahweh, for example, the Tetragrammaton, it appears 7,000 times in the Hebrew Bible. 7,000 times is pretty important. When you're studying a Hebrew or any language course, oftentimes the way that they'll present the vocabulary is anything that you see 50 times or more, and then 100 times or whatever, right? They'll give you the ones that are the most frequent because those are the ones that you're going to encounter the most, and typically those are the things that have the most impact because they're in there for a reason, because they're important, right? You look at an individual book like Philippians, the term joy or rejoice appears at least, I don't even remember, I think it's like 25 times or something like that. When you see a word appearing that much, there's a theme there that you shouldn't ignore. So when you see women mentioned as often as they are throughout these texts, that's something that we also should not ignore. Romans 16, and then we'll get to these other verses here, but I want to give you all this context. Romans 16:1. By the way, some scholars believe, and it's debatable, right? But some scholars believe that the letter to the Romans was the most important letter that Paul ever wrote. That the message that he was trying to convey which, by the way, it's interesting. I've come to have a very deep appreciation for the book of Romans, because I used to think it was one of the least Jewish, writings that had a Jewish background. And now I think it's quite the opposite. It's one of the most, under the underpinnings is very Torah oriented and very Jewish oriented. And this is the message that, is chock full of things that are vital for the life of the assembly. And who is the message entrusted to disseminate it? Take a guess. A woman. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the assembly in Cenchrea. A deacon? A deacon is a position of leadership, right? So if you go to Acts 6, we won't turn there, but in Acts 6, there were deacons, the first deacons that were put in place, people like Stephen, who was martyred, Philip, not Philip the apostle, but the Philip that met the Ethiopian, right? And then there were others, right? Positions of importance, not necessarily positions of authority over others, right? In the sense that you would like with an elder, a pastor, or an apostle, but still positions of leadership, right? That's why I said positions of leadership in effect, because there's a difference, right? But that's a woman. I ask you to receive her in Yahweh in a way worthy of his people, and to give her any help she may need from you, for she has been the benefactor of many people, including me. But let's not stop there. Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my co-workers in Messiah Yahshua. Who is Priscilla? Well, first of all, she's a woman. She was the wife of Aquila, right? And you see them in the book of Acts, in Corinth, and other things. They risked their lives for me. Not only I, but all the assemblies of the Gentiles are grateful to them, right? Greet also the assembly that meets at their house. So they had a home fellowship, Priscilla and Aquila, and they're mentioned as a pair, right? And then, there's some more that he reads here. Greet Mary, verse 6, probably Miriam in Hebrew, who worked very hard for you. What does that mean? Who worked very hard for you? I don't know what that means. Well, we can immediately take on a sexist view and think that work was just, some kind of serving or anything, but that's not what it says. It just says who worked very hard for you, left it up to you for, remember, we don't know. Part of the reason why these passages are a little bit difficult to interpret is because we do not know exactly what they were responding to when they wrote them, right? We're doing a lot of guesswork, a lot of speculation, and you never can forget that, especially the verses that we're going to look at in just a few minutes. Notice verse 7, greet Andronicus and Junia, my fellow Jews who have been in prison with me. Junia? Some scholars have made an attempt to turn that into a masculine name. Sorry, that is not a masculine name. That is not a masculine name. My fellow Jews who have been in prison with me? Why was Junia in prison? Maybe because she was doing stuff that she shouldn't have been doing according to the authorities, like preaching, or who knows, right? We don't know. That's the point. We don't know. Well, she was only there maybe because she was with her husband. Show me the verse. They're outstanding. It doesn't even end there, right? They're outstanding among the apostles, and they were in Messiah before I was. They were outstanding among the apostles? What does that mean? They, not Andronicus, they are outstanding among the apostles. Was Junia considered an apostle? Now, I was mentioning last week that in the strictest sense of the term apostle, okay, there are only 12 apostles. In terms of that title, you might call apostle with a capital A. The word apostle means an emissary. It's someone who's sent out on a specific mission. And according to context of many different verses, there were only 12. And there are several reasons why I say that. One of the reasons being, though, that they had to have seen Yahshua. The conditions in Acts 1 was that they had to have walked with him, and they had to have witnessed him and actually been with him a while, right? But other people are also called apostles. The apostle Paul. Paul was called an apostle. Paul did see Yahshua, but he didn't walk with him while he was in his ministry. So he wasn't one of the 12, right? Then James is referred to as an apostle, Yahshua's brother, right? And apparently, so there were people who were referred to as apostles that were not in the formal apostle ministry, okay? And Junia appears to be one of them. What does that mean? I don't know, but we can't discount it. And it goes on speaking from there, right? And then, Okay, so anyway, so he commends Phoebe, this deacon, right? I commend to you our sister Phoebe through this letter, right? So again, the importance of women in distributing the message, right? Now, I was going to go to Luke 10, but we'll come back to Luke 10 a little bit later. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1. And I'm going to read these verses in N.T. Wright's translation, the Kingdom New Testament, because it's in my view, a better translation. Now, there are going to be some differences from something like the NIV that I normally use, and as we get to those, I'll point some of those differences out. So 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1, I'm going to give you the sense of these passages and give you food for thought. We're not going to come to definitive conclusions on these, but I'm going to give you possibilities, all right? So he says, copy me just as I'm copying the Messiah. I congratulate you. And by the way, just, you need to know just a little background about Corinth. Corinth was a metropolitan city in Greece, and it was located at a very strategic isthmus in Greece, which made them accessible to all kinds of people internationally going through Greece. Okay, so they would have had a wide variety of audience here in Corinth, and because of that they had unique issues and problems. So he says, copy me just as I'm copying the Messiah. Imitate me just as I'm imitating the Messiah, most versions say. He says, I congratulate you that you are remembering me in everything, and you are keeping the traditions as I handed them on to you. But I want you to know this, that the Messiah is the head of every man, and the husband is the head of every wife, and Elohim is the head of the Messiah. Every man who prays or prophesies while wearing something on his head brings shame on his head, and every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered brings shame on her head. So man covered brings shame, woman uncovered brings shame on her head. It will be just the same if she had her head shaved. For if a woman isn't covered, then she should be shaved. But if it's shameful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then let her be covered. A man ought not to cover his head, you see. He is the image and glory of Elohim. It always goes back to that concept of the image of Elohim. But a wife is the glory of her husband. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. And man was not created for the sake of woman, but woman for the sake of man. That's why the wife must have authority on her head because of the angels. However, woman is not apart from man. I want you to note this verse. Woman is not apart from man, nor man apart from woman. Other versions say woman is not independent from man, nor man independent from woman. What is that? Again, they're incomplete, the one without the other in Yahweh. For just as woman came from man, so now man comes into the world by means of woman, and everything is from Yahweh. And then he goes on talking more about headship. So I'm not going to concentrate on the concept of headship in terms of whether a woman should have her head covered and all that. I have my own opinions about that, and we could take that another day. But the more important thing here is the relationship between men and women. What's happening here and in some of these other verses, and just so you know, I chose, and there are others, but I chose 5 verses that I just wanted to touch upon today. 1 Corinthians 11, 1 to 16, 1 Corinthians 14, 34 to 35, 1 Timothy 2, 8 to 15, that's a doozy, Titus 2, 3 to 5, and then 1 Peter 3, 1 to 7. So what is going on here? What is he talking about? Well, remember that none of the things that are written in these letters are written as doctrinal studies, right? Paul didn't write 1 Corinthians 11, 1 to 16 so that he can give us a doctrinal study about headship. They were responding to specific issues and problems that were going on in these various assemblies, right? So the one to the Corinthians was written to the assembly at Corinth. And one of the problems that the assembly at Corinth had was they didn't work well together. They were in disunity. And Paul needed to correct that. So he's trying to show them what models of relating of men and women are evident with regard to the assembly. What are the models that we should be, in light of new creation, in light of the fact that men and women should be working together to be image bearers of Almighty Yahweh for a greater purpose? In other words, to promote this assembly as a model of new creation, to promote this assembly to the world as what we're supposed to look like, what humanity is supposed to look like, then you have to understand the relationship between men and women. Paul expects, in this case here, right, he expects men and women to be behaving in a way that models what the assembly should look like. And that includes the relationships between men and women. So he talks about this concept of a head, right? And he says, I congratulate you that you're remembering me in everything and you are keeping the traditions as I handed them on to you. But I want you to know this, that the Messiah, and then he starts to go on to describe a hierarchical structure. The Messiah is the head of every man. The husband is the head of every wife, and the Elohim is the head of the Messiah. And it's interesting because in this translation, he has head in quotation marks in each case here, because there are really two things going on. There's kind of a play on words that's occurring here. So there's the concept of head, which he's describing in the context of a covering on the actual physical head, a physical covering, but that's metaphorical. In other words, there's a metaphorical message, a symbolic message by the head coverings. The head coverings were physical, but the physical head covering is symbolic of a bigger concept, a greater concept, which is why we refer to it as headship, right? What it is a hierarchy, an established order that Almighty Yahweh is talking about. And this is what I was saying earlier when I was talking about the equality of men and women, that I would talk about later, that there is, with regard to leadership in the assembly, there, and not just in the assembly, but leadership in life, in Yahweh's created order, there is a hierarchical order that he has established for leadership, that when everyone does their part, the whole system, it's a system, the whole system works properly. And that system is not dependent upon human culture. That system is not dependent upon whims and social mores. That system is dependent upon Yahweh saying, this is the way I want to see this system work, because this is the best way that it works. So in this particular instance, as a microcosm of that larger hierarchical order, what you're seeing here is in the assembly serving as a model for the world, remember, right? So presumably what's happening in the assembly in terms of relationships between men and women is what you should also be seeing in the greater world. So what happens in the assembly with regard to women and men in leadership is parallel, excuse me, is parallel to relationships between men and women, for example, husband and wife, right? Or student and teacher, or boss and subordinate. So all of these things work together in the same way. And what Paul is talking about here is that he doesn't want to blur the lines between men and women and how they do things publicly. That is his emphasis throughout this whole passage. He wants to make sure that whatever the men and women are doing in this public worship, they're doing it in such a way that anyone who sees is going to understand the clear distinction between men and women. Keep in mind that the public image of the assembly is crucial to Paul, especially in that culture. Never forget that the assembly, and it was true back then and it's true today, the assembly is the model of what Yahweh's world is supposed to be like. So the way that we act towards one another, whether we love each other or whether we treat each other like trash and with hypocrisy, when the world sees that, they react accordingly, right? This is why we have to, we are, it all starts, judgment starts with the house of Elohim, right? We have to be the model, the exemplary body to show everyone else how it's done. It's just the way it's supposed to work. And oftentimes we as the body of Messiah do that very poorly. And historically, the assembly has done that very poorly. And that's why, you see so much strife and so many problems today. To give you one example, right? We're studying a series right now about racism in America, right? Just think, and this particular series is rather interesting because it's pointing out how the church, right, as it's known, has been largely responsible because they were complicit with much of the racist activity and many of the racist attitudes. Because the church was complicit, then they lost their moral authority to essentially model to the world what proper relationships between people should be. So that's happened not just with issues of race, but with issues of gender, the power politics that you see between men and women, issues dealing with parents to children, and on we could go. The body of Messiah as a whole, in many ways, has failed in its responsibility to model the kingdom way of life. And because of that, the world has usurped the authority to do it. So a lot of the things that are being out there today, culturally, economically, socially, they're out in left field. And I don't mean that politically, but out in left field in terms of, out of the pale of what they should be. Why? Because we dropped the ball. So if race issues in our country have run amok, and now people today are trying to solve those issues in a secular way that do not jibe with what the scriptures teach, you know what? We're partly to blame because we haven't done our job. And so it is with male and female issues. And Paul knew this in his day. So this is the point. It seems like I'm going all over the place, but I'm not. It comes back to this. The public image of the assembly was crucial to Paul because he knew that people would be looking. They were constantly under the public eye. Because of the religious nature of the movement, people were already suspicious of this movement. One of the things that the assembly did is they talked about themselves as like a family, right? So so how does a family act? If a family is dysfunctional, they're not going to have a lot of credibility. If we're trying to show the model family, we have to be above the fray. We have to be above par. If outsiders saw a picture of the assembly that blurred the acceptable image of that family, or of what men were supposed to be like and what women were supposed to be like, it could cause a scandal and diminish the reputation and the character of the assembly. And Paul wanted to avoid that. And much of the book of 1 Corinthians is dedicated to talking about that. Watch out so that when people come in, they don't see certain things that are going to be unseemly, right? And you're going to lose your witness, and you're going to make things, you're going to make a mess of things. And this is what he's discussing here with regard to the relationship between men and women. But notice an interesting thing here that I don't want you to miss. Because and before I even look at that, I want you to hold your place in 1 Corinthians 11. And then I want you to go over to the traditional verse that puts everybody in a tizzy, right? And that's 1 Corinthians 14, 34 and 35. And I'm going to read that in the NIV. Everyone with me so far? Okay. 1 Corinthians 14, so it's 3 chapters later. 34. Women should remain silent in the assemblies. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the assembly. Whoa, that's pretty blunt. That's pretty heavy-handed, Paul, right? What does that mean? It's up for debate. But I got to tell you what I think it does not mean, right? I don't think this means, like many people over literally thousands of years now, right, have tried to make it mean that women should absolutely shut their mouths in the congregations and they shouldn't speak. They shouldn't, right? They shouldn't have any kind of say in anything that goes on. How do I know that that's not true? That it cannot mean that? I don't know. I'm going to tell you right now. I don't know exactly what all this means. I have possibilities I could share with you, but I cannot explain to you exactly what this means, because remember that in all these letters, we're not privy to exactly every issue that they were trying to deal with. Book of Galatians is like the most difficult in that regard, because we don't have all the things that they're trying to answer. But just out of sheer logic and context, I can tell you, in my opinion, that this is not a blanket quenching of any leadership that a woman can have in the assembly. Why do I know that? Because it would invalidate something said 3 chapters before. What would it invalidate? Well, let's go 3 chapters before. Let's go back to 1 Corinthians 11, and let's look at verse 2. I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions. Okay, not verse 2, verse 4. Every man who prays or prophesies, hard stop. Who prays or prophesies. What is prophesy? What does that mean? Does it mean a la Jeremiah, Isaiah, that you get up and you declare a prophecy and you declare the future and all that? No, That's not what that's saying at all, right? The word prophesy in this context is kind of a way of saying this person preaches, this person expounds the word, he exhorts the word of Yahweh, right? So when you look at 1 Corinthians 14, again, we're going to just kind of hopping back and forth here. 1 Corinthians 11, 1 Corinthians 14. Let's go to 14 and verse, let's see. 29. 1 Corinthians 14, 29. 2 or 3 prophets should speak, and the other should weigh carefully what is said. And if a revelation comes to someone who is sitting down, the first speaker should stop, for you can all prophesy in turn so that everyone may be instructed and encouraged. 2 or 3 prophets should speak. So what is that? You have 2 or 3 Jeremiahs and Isaiahs in there? No, right? That's not the context of the Greek word that's translated prophecy here. The word prophet here is a person who is expounding the word, a preacher, someone who's preaching the word of Yahweh. Back to 1 Corinthians 11, verse 4. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. Verse 5. But every woman who, what? Prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. Okay. All right. Help me understand here. Help me understand like I'm a 4-year-old, right? The man prays or prophesies. The woman prays or prophesies. There's no distinction here between what the man is prophesying and what the woman is prophesying. Oh, no, but she's only talking to other women. Show me where it says that. Oh, no, she's only teaching children. Show me where it says that. You understand how we lay down interpretations and we lay down the law about how things are done because they're just interpretations. Oh, well, what you're saying is an interpretation. Yeah, what you're saying is also an interpretation. Yeah, but this is the way we interpret it for 2,000 years. Yeah, an interpretation of 2,000 years is still an interpretation, right? So what gives here? 3 chapters later, it says women should be quiet. 3 chapters before, it says women pray and prophesy in the assembly publicly. His problem is not with women praying or prophesying. His problem is women praying and prophesying, looking like women while they're doing it. Because men are men and women are women. And then the rest of the chapter discusses specifics in terms of what that's supposed to look like. And that's not really my interest. So I'm not going to really go through that per se, right? But what we're showing here is that there is a clear thing that's being spoken here that just a few chapters later seems to be contradicted. It's not being contradicted. What exactly does that mean a few chapters later? Well, I'll give you a couple of possibilities, but it doesn't mean that women don't speak at all. Now, what do they preach? What do they exhort? I don't know, right? So that would be, I think, improper of me to say, okay, well, that means women can now be preaching all the time. I can't say that because I don't know exactly what that means. But I cannot just make a blanket statement saying, well, women are supposed to not even, have any kind of a speaking role in the assembly. Okay. So we'll come back and I'll say a little bit more about that. Okay. Verses 11 and 12 are important, right? Nevertheless, in Yahweh, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. That's that equality that we see in the beginning. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman, right? Here, the gender politics of the world, right? Well, if you didn't have, if you didn't have women giving birth, then men wouldn't exist, and ha ha ha, and yeah, but if Adam hadn't been there and we hadn't gotten a piece of his flesh, women would never have come into existence. Ha ha ha, right? So let's stop that nonsense. Okay. Let's recognize the equality that exists and what each brings to the table in terms of their own unique qualities. And they are unique because there are distinctions between men and women, and they are independent. They are dependent the one on the other, right? Everything, as it concludes in verse 12, everything comes from Yahweh. And we saw that in Genesis, right? And then he goes on describing some other things about headship. Okay. So he's trying to remind the Corinthians that you're different, right? You men and women are different. It's not correct when people don't recognize the differences. So apparently he values women potentially in leadership, right? but insists that men should have their heads uncovered and women's heads covered when leading in worship, if that's what that means. So he's basically saying, pray as men and pray as women. Do not do anything that brings shame. Honor and shame were important concepts back then, more so than they are today, because people understood and they had a general agreement. Unlike today, they had a general agreement in their understanding of the norms of what they consider to be appropriate. So Paul is saying, make sure that you show that difference, right? And by the way, that term head, the term is kephale. You might write that Kephale, kephale, or kephale. It means head. It could mean beginning, sum total, or first fruits, reshit. What do we know about first fruits, reshit? When do we talk about first fruits, reshit? During the Feast of Weeks, right? What is significant about the Feast of Weeks? What do we, whenever we talk about the wave sheaf offering, which is the reshit, the first fruits, right? It's a different two things. You have the Feast of Weeks, which is the first fruits that happen in the later harvest around the summertime, right? But then you also have the Omer, which is a type of first fruits that is pointing to resurrection, right? When you look, whenever we do the sermon about the first fruits, we look at 1 Corinthians, surprise, surprise. A few chapters later, 1 Corinthians 15, that talks about first fruits. Okay, it's a different type of first fruits than the one in the Feast of Weeks, but it's a first fruits nevertheless. So the idea is the idea is my main point here is the idea is that of order. So when you're talking about the crops, you're talking about you can't do certain things with the rest of the crop until what? Until you offer the first fruits. And that's both true in the Passover time with the first fruits of the barley, as it is with the first fruits of the wheat, which is later during Feast of Weeks time at Pentecost, right? But you can't touch any of the crops of those harvests until you deal with the first fruits, because there's an order, right? So don't turn there, just listen. But in 1 Corinthians 15, I preach this every year, right? That there's an order. This is 1 Corinthians 15, 20. But Messiah has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since death came through a man, Adam, the resurrection of the dead comes also through a man, Adam. For as in the new Adam, for as in Adam all die, so in Messiah all will be made alive, but each in turn. Messiah the first fruits, then when he comes, those who belong to him, then, right, everything in its proper order. So when he talks about headship back in 1 Corinthians 11, he's talking about an order imposed from above. Yahweh's order, which is the way that everything works out well. It envisions the interlocking whole of the entire creation, everything in its place. It's a hierarchy of being. Everyone knows, including male and female, where they belong within that hierarchy. Creation has its own order: wisdom, fruitfulness, and happiness, not disorder and gender politics and biting and backbiting and anger and flailing back and forth. Wisdom, fruitfulness, and happiness come from maintaining the balance that Yahweh gave. And that's distorted by cultural representations that incorrectly interpret them. Because people interpret them through a secular point of view and a secular lens rather than through the word of Yahweh, our world has been turned upside down. That's not the kind of world that we're inheriting. We're inheriting a new world that Yahweh himself has given us. So we have to be at the forefront of explaining the distinctions that Yahweh has created for our good, for wisdom, for fruitfulness, and for happiness to come. So let's not buy into the cultural nonsense that always wants to pit us against one another, men against women. And by the way, men against women, slave versus free, classes, right? Economic classes, social classes, race, right? The race issues that we're explaining, that we're dealing with today, have a long and painful history. But if we're honest and truthful about the solution is not a secular solution. The solution is not even an economic solution or a social solution. The solution, my friends, is a spiritual solution. And we are supposed to be on the forefront to teach people that in Yahweh, we're all supposed to be on the same page. And this is what he's trying to show here in this situation in the context of men and women at Corinth. Men and women are equal and not less than one another in the image of Yahweh. So he's reestablishing that hierarchy here in these verses. And for example, the woman has the sign of authority on her head. Well, what does that mean? What is this sign of authority, this head covering? We can debate whether the head covering was just a cultural thing for their day or whether it needs to be imposed today. Okay. I'll just tell you, my personal opinion is that, my preference, I'll put it that way. My preference is that during worship that a woman still wear a head covering, but I will not give problems to any woman who decides not to wear a head covering because of cultural context. Why? Why do I say that? Because the way I view it, the ultimate outcome is not the head covering. It's what the head covering represented, which is an adherence to that order that Almighty Yahweh gave. And in the context of the first century in which Paul lived, it was very clearly identified by everyone as a woman having her head covered. In the 21st century, not so much. So if someone comes and sees a woman with her head covered and a woman without her head covered, for most people, it's like 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Unless you were raised in an environment where the head covering, it has that symbolism, most of the world today doesn't care one way or the other. Am I saying that we should do things necessarily based on whether the world cares? No. But in that context, that was an immediate red flag to anyone coming from the outside that looked and said, what is this? Why do the woman have the head uncovered? Is she, let me just be blunt, is she a prostitute? Is she making herself available? Because a woman who was married or a woman who was chaste under her household had her head covered. So what is the equivalent today? We get so hung up on these things, and then we have doctrinal spats and all kinds of foolishness that miss the mark, that miss the point. And then we spend 3 years in disarray and divided because we don't have women wearing head coverings, or because the head covering is too short, and because it doesn't cover enough. And I've seen these things all my years in service to Almighty Yahweh since I was 15 years old, and I'm 50 some odd years today, right? And to what end? What is the point of all this? Is the point of going before Almighty Yahweh on Judgment Day and say, you know what? I treated people like trash, but I had my head covered. I'm in good shape. I treated people with hypocrisy, and I came down on people with like a ton of bricks, but you know what? My beard was full. Do you see how silly and ridiculous that sounds? And how empty and hollow that's going to ring before a just creator on Judgment Day? I'm not interested in those kind of arguments anymore in my life. I'm way past them. So today, you want to get to the point. The point is, leave the gender politics at the door. Matter of fact, don't leave them at the door. Don't even adopt them. Get rid of them. Show people that there's a distinction between men and women. Women dress like women. And that's open to interpretation, but there's certain norms that we all do. Men dress like men. Men act like men. Women act like women. And we can debate from here till tomorrow what exactly that means, right? So we won't go into that right now. But my point is that when you act in a way that shows the final result, that there is a distinction between men and women, and that Yahweh has a created order, there's no need for a head covering to prove that. So we can debate that another day. And if you want to challenge me on that, I'm more than open to it. What I'm aiming to do with all these kinds of studies is to try to raise our understanding to a higher level, to get away from that, forgive me, but that infantile spiritual understanding that causes endless divisions and word fightings, like Paul describes. To not get in, he tells Timothy, don't get into endless word fightings. And this is what you see in the body of Messiah, endlessly. I can't tell you how many divisions I've witnessed in my lifetime. How does that look to a world in need? That is horrific. That is not honoring to Yahshua the Messiah. It is not honoring to the Messiah to win a ridiculous, petty, local battle and to lose the war. And I want us to stop thinking that way. I want us to start thinking like mature believers who are no longer always drinking little things of milk, but that are going on to meat, because we have a job to do. In case you haven't noticed, and I don't mean to be condescending here, please, but if in case you haven't noticed, this world is not in a good case right now. And if we're not part of the solution, then we're just part of the problem. If we're going to continue to just go with the flow like everyone else, we will never be able to show the example of new creation. And that is the message of the gospel. The message that the kingdom of Yahweh is among us, Yahshua has risen, and the kingdom of Yahweh is going to fill this entire earth. And you need to get with the program because there's a new king in town. So can we do that? Can we get away from the pettiness and start going in that direction? I hope so. So let's move on from this. There's more I could say. For example, it talks about to have a covering because of the angels. What does that refer to? Maybe to her husband. It could be referring to the leader of the assembly. If you look in the book of Revelation, the leaders of the 7 assemblies, they're referred to as angels, right? It could even be before literal angels themselves, right? Because when you're in, remember, this is in the context of public worship. So if worship is occurring at that moment, it's as if heaven and earth are coming together during that time. So in other words, because you're always in the presence of the heavenly hosts, you want to do things with respect and authority. That's why she had to have the covering on, right? Okay. 1 Corinthians 14, I mentioned that I might mention a couple of possibilities. One is a possibility, but I don't buy it necessarily, and I don't think we go by it. And that's 1 Corinthians 14, 34, 35. Women should remain silent in the assemblies. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the assembly. Now, first of all, when you take a passage like that, you cannot take it out of context. What is the context of this passage? Well, I have a little notation, and I don't always go by the notations of the paragraph titles, right? But in my NIV, starting with 26, I have a little notation saying good order in worship. I don't know if you have something similar to that. Good order in worship. And that's exactly what this section is talking about. Order in the worship service. This is where it talks about if anyone's speaking in a tongue, and by the way, that speaking in a tongue, that's another study in and of itself. That speaking in a tongue is not an incomprehensible, gibberish. That tongue the word is glossa. It's really the term glossolalia, which means a known language. So it's referring to a foreign liturgy. Okay. So if anyone's speaking a foreign liturgy, someone has to translate, right? Because if someone comes, I used to translate for someone who only spoke Spanish. So he would come and he wouldn't fully understand the message or all the nuances if I didn't translate for him. So they asked me to translate for him, and I did it for maybe a couple of years, where the preacher would preach and I would give him not word for word, but sense, idiom for idiom. I'd give him the sense of each passage and each section, and he left edified, right? And this is what it's talking about, that if you have, because remember, this was the cosmopolitan environment, so you had people with different, with different languages who were speaking. And they didn't want gibberish. They didn't want a free-for-all where everyone was just kind of, what's going on, right? That's happened to me before. I remember one time I didn't know, and I went to a Jewish service, and this particular branch, I didn't know that the entire service was in Hebrew, right? And at that time, I had studied a little Hebrew in college, but I certainly didn't know it to be able to understand it as people, I still don't, to be able to understand it as they're speaking it. And I didn't know that the whole service was kind of going through the prayer book. This was an Orthodox one in school in one of the Hillel groups. So I came in on Sabbath evening, and I stood up with everybody, and they were going through the Hebrew, and I kept waiting for the rabbi to come up front and start the service, and he never showed up because it doesn't work that way. It's literally everyone goes through the prayer book, and then all of a sudden everyone says, "Okay, we'll go home," right? So next time I picked another one that was in English. But think about it. I'm thinking that's the confusion. I didn't know, but it happened once, and then I didn't do it again, right? So I sat there, and I had no clue. I had no clue if that what was being done. So I wasn't edified in that service. And Paul wanted to keep that from happening. So everything that's being described here, right? 29. Okay, so after he talks about the tongues, about the necessity for interpretation, then he talks about 2 or 3 prophets speak and the others wait carefully. In other words, everyone does things in turn, right? You don't have one person get up and then say, no, 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 that's not exactly true, right? No, everyone turns. You know, we have other ministers here among us today, and if one of them was speaking, I would listen and then I speak. And one of them has invited me to his Bible studies. And the Bible study, when he's going through stuff with his assembly, I don't interrupt him every 5 seconds. You forgot to mention this, right? No. If he says, hey, Carlos, do you have any opinion on this particular thing? Then I say, thank you. Yes, I do. And then I give my opinion, right? And this is how you keep order. And then everyone is edified, right? So by the time you get down to verse 34, you have a context here, right? Women should remain silent in the assembly. But what's happening here? Well, the first explanation that I don't necessarily buy, but it's brought up by a reputable New Testament scholar, is that passage was not even there, that passage was added later. Is a gentleman by the name of Gordon Fee. He wrote a couple of the books that I own. One of them is called How to Read the Bible Book for Book, and another one is How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. He's a very, very good New Testament scholar, so I don't take what he says lightly. And he's actually said is that one theory is that many manuscripts of the New Testament have that paragraph missing in the early manuscripts. So is it possible that someone maybe inserted that later for their own agenda? It's possible, but it's not entirely convincing for me. And I don't usually like to accept those kinds of explanations simply because it appears to people as a cop-out, right? That, well, no, you're trying to sidestep the issue. So I don't necessarily believe that. But is it possible? Absolutely. You have other passages that I won't go into now, but part of the end of Mark may not have originally been there. And there are other verses that are scattered throughout the New Testament that may not have been in the original manuscript. So is it possible? Of course it's possible, because there were corruptions like that in the text. But here's another possible interpretation that makes a lot more sense to me. So there are some traditions that in the Middle East where women will sit on one side of the assembly and some on the other, right? And the service might be held in a foreign liturgy, because we already know that's possible because they're talking here about the possibility of that. So it must have happened where they had someone speaking in Hebrew or Aramaic or Greek or whatever it was, and other people needed a translator, right? So if women are on one side and men are on the other side and the service is held in a foreign liturgy, it could be that women who were on the one section didn't have an interpreter and didn't understand what was being said with the foreign liturgy. If that happens, what happens when people don't understand something and they're just sitting there for hours on end? What happens? They get frustrated. They get bored. They start talking amongst one another, right? So could it have been that there were instances in the Corinthian assembly where that happened, and then it started to get noisy, and at some point the leader of the worship had to say, "Hey, guys, you need to be quiet. And if you're not really sure about what this is, what that is, ask your husbands at home." Entirely possible that might have happened. So, and I'll have a little bit more to say about this when we look at 1 Timothy 2, which I got to pick up the pace here, okay? But because there may be some in there as well. But I'm just opening up the possibility. But we know that it doesn't mean don't speak. We already been there, took a look at that, rejected that, right? Because a few chapters before, we see that they do speak. So, comment, I wonder if Paul also went deeper into women being quiet, having to do with who he was addressing, Corinth, a place where it had the largest temple of Aphrodite, and their priests were women, where temples were temples only for goddesses. Okay, were temples, or are you saying where temples? Were the temples only for goddesses? I don't know. That's a good question. But your point is actually rather interesting, because I do believe that that may have to do with the next passage in 1 Timothy. So is that possible that these two are related? Absolutely possible. And Aphrodite, many of you may know from Greek mythology, she was the goddess of erotic love, right? And that worship was centralized in Corinth among many other types of worship. It wasn't the only one, but it was a primary one. And it was one where women were prominent. And maybe it was a reaction to some of that. It's absolutely possible. In which case, it may be a cultural reference to basically say to the women, you may, because remember, we got people here who are not just Jewish, but people who came from pagan Greek backgrounds. So were there women in this group who may have been involved in the worship of Aphrodite? who thought, hey, the things that we did there for the worship of Aphrodite, we could just do them here too. And we could just talk whenever we want or whatever. And usurp authority from men. That's a no-no, right? You got to do everything with decorum. Remember, a few chapters before, and this is chapters, right, for us, but for them, it's just one long letter, right? Just a couple of minutes ago, a couple of breaths ago, Paul had said, let everything be, everything's going to be done decently in order according to the hierarchy that Yahweh has established. And here, we don't do that. Okay? So I've just given you three potential explanations. You may not buy any of them, right? But I ask you to consider possibilities, because the alternative is to be dogmatic about things over which I believe we cannot be dogmatic. And that dogmatism has caused untold abuses, in my opinion, in the way that people have been treated, particularly women. That's my opinion. All right, let's do 1 Timothy 2. You guys will be patient with me. Just hang out for just a little bit longer. I will try to get through this quickly because I don't want to go to a part 3. 1 Timothy 2, verse 8, and I'm going to read through 15. I urge then, 1 Timothy 2, 8. Therefore, I want the men everywhere to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or disputing. I also want the women to dress modestly with decency and propriety, adorning themselves, not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship Elohim. There it is. Women can't wear jewelry. Women can't, they can't have braids in their hair. And if they have braids, they should only have 2, but they shouldn't have 4. You think I'm being ridiculous? I've seen and heard all of these in my time in worshiping Yahweh in different groups. So 2 braids are okay, but 3 is ostentatious. 2 braids okay, but 3, and you want to look like Bo Derek. Okay, now I'm showing my age. If anyone wants to know who Bo Derek is, you have to go look it up on Google at this point, right? And on it goes in terms of the things that we elevate to the status of important in worship, right? Or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship Elohim. A woman should learn. Thank you so much, Luis. I really appreciate you being here. Yeah, Luis is Saida's. Yes. Okay. Anyway, Luis is he is a youth pastor. He's a Saida's family, and we really appreciate him being here. So, Yahweh bless you, and I hope to see you soon. Continuing with verse 11. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. Uh-oh, here we go again, Paul. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. Gee, thanks, Paul. So, once again, we take things and we attach a context to it, and then, we just kind of run with it. So what's happening here? Well, a number of things are happening. First of all, verses 8 to 10, keep in mind that in the big picture, Paul, once again, is trying to show propriety, the distinctions between men and women, and he's talking about breaking stereotypes. Different context here with Timothy, because does anyone know who Timothy was a bishop of at some point? That he became the leader. Does anyone know? No, not Philippi. Ephesus. Now, just like we learned that in Corinth, the worship of Aphrodite was prominent. What was prominent at Ephesus? The worship of Diana, Artemis. You see that in Acts chapter 19. Okay, you can go look that up later. Big worship. One of the wonders considered historically as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Temple of Diana, Temple of Artemis. And if you look in the record in the book of Acts, it was the scene of one of the major riots that almost got Paul killed, right? So huge. So, and by the way, interesting, one of the elements of the worship of Artemis, only female only priestesses. Female only priestesses. It was a cult. It was a female driven cult. Already you can see where I'm heading with this, right? So he's showing distinctions between men and women. First, he's saying, don't go with the stereotypes, right? He's trying to show them to model to the world what we're supposed to be like as a community. Therefore, I want the men everywhere to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or disputing. Because men, what do? Men are testosterone driven, right? Let's just be blunt, right? They argue all the time, right? And they go back and forth, right? He says, men, instead of doing this is what you do, right? We're not going to be angry all the time and disputing and having. Instead, pray, lift up holy hands without the anger and disputing, and be gentle and do what you need to do, right? And also the women, same thing. Don't give in to the cultural stereotypes, right? He wants you to dress modestly with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls. He's not saying don't adorn yourselves with hairstyles and with jewelry or expensive clothes, but he's saying don't define yourself by that. Your lives are not defined by the external. Don't give in to the stereotype that you're the pretty decorations, right? Don't define yourself by the elaborate hairdos and the jewelry, and right? Don't give in to the stereotypes. In other words, that's not like the world sees it. In so many cases, that's not all it means to be a woman, focusing on the external, but rather the internal, right? Good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship Elohim. So the first thing he's telling them is don't define yourselves by the stereotypes. Then he starts talking about this business about learning in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. Now, here's the translation that comes from N.T. Wright, who is a marvelous scholar. And this is his translation. I think he also knows what he's talking about. He says, instead, verse 11, they must study undisturbed in full submission to Elohim. I'm not saying that women should teach men or try to dictate to them, rather that they should be left undisturbed. That's a much different translation than the traditional translation. I'm going to read that again. This is not a paraphrase, by the way. This is a translation. I'll tell you what this translation that I use so frequently. Okay, I'm not trying to pull a fast one on anybody and use some weird paraphrase. This is a translation by a major New Testament scholar. He wrote this translation. He didn't start out as a translation, a whole full translation. He wrote a commentary, which is known as the Everyman Commentary, and he wrote it piecemeal for different books of the New Testament. And he literally, for every commentary that he wrote, he did his own translation of the book. And then when the whole thing was done, the whole commentary series was done, the publisher went back and said, hey, can we just publish this as the whole Bible? And he took it, put it into this, and that's where you got this from. But it's a translation. They must study undisturbed in full submission to Elohim. I'm not saying that women should teach men or try to dictate to them, rather that they should be left undisturbed. That's a very different message. So what's going on here when you kind of put all this together? Well, he's saying that women should be learning, right? Instead of, this goes along with what was just said. Don't worry about the external, but worry about the internal good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship Elohim. How do you learn how to do that? How do you learn to do good deeds? You learn by being a student. So he's saying a woman should learn in quietness. Even if you go with that, a woman should learn in quietness and full submission. By the way, that full submission, elsewhere, he also talks about the men learning in full submission. So it's not a male-female thing. Both men and women, their attitude when learning from Almighty Yahweh is full submission. So this has nothing to do with full submission to a man. This has to do with full submission to Yahweh. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. And I love the way he translated it, that they must study undisturbed. Study, right? They must study undisturbed. They have to have a teachable spirit. The words, there are a couple of words here that are interesting. Let her learn, the word in Greek is manthaneto. You might write that M-A-N-T-H-A-N-E-T-O, manthaneto. It comes from the word mathetes, You know what the word mathetes is throughout the New Testament? Mathetes is disciple. And then it says she has to, in quietness. It talks about Hezekiah is leisure, leisure to study. In other words, let her have leisure to study. So it's saying she should study undisturbed in discipleship, in leisure, undisturbed, so that she can concentrate. I mentioned before that I would go back to Luke 10. Let's go to Luke 10:38. And I think this is exactly what you see happening here in Luke 10. Which, by the way, is example of new creation, because this was culturally different than what women had been used to. That happened with Yahshua all the time. The woman who came and broke the perfume, and she's touching him, and the disciples say, "What? You're letting her touch you? Leave her alone." Yahshua kept turning things upside its head, right? The woman with an issue of blood, right? She had a blood disease of some sort. An issue of blood, that means that she had physically blood, right? Something that was happening with an issue of blood. She touched him. He didn't turn around and say, "Get away from me, you wicked woman. How dare you?" He turned around and said, "Who touched me?" And then when he found out, it says that she came to him trembling. Why was she trembling? Because in the ancient world, women didn't go around touching men, much less rabbis, right? So she goes to him and she touches him and says, "It's me." And he says, "Relax. Your faith has saved you." Right? He wasn't paying attention to the fact that she touched him any more than he was paying attention to the leper that touched him in Mark chapter 1, right? Okay. Turning things upside their head. Conventions upside their head. Luke 10, verse 38. We read this all the time, but do we really stop to think about it? Do we really stop to get it? On their journey, Yahshua came into a village. There was a woman there named Martha who welcomed him. She had a sister named Mary, who sat at the master's feet and listened to his teaching. Who sat at the master's feet and listened to his teaching. And then Martha has an issue with that, right? Verse 41, "Martha, Martha," he replied, "you are fretting and fussing about so many things. You're so worried about so many things. But guess what? Only one thing matters. Miriam has chosen the best part, and it's not going to be taken away from her." What part had she chosen? To sit at his feet and to learn. What does that mean? That she's sitting at his feet, lovingly admiring everything he's saying, just for the sake of, "Oh, this is a nice afternoon that I'm getting some teaching." And by the way, these were Lazarus' sisters, right? We find out in John 11. That's not what it means. They were studying. She was studying. She was along with the rest of the disciples studying. And what did the disciples study for? A disciple studied just for this, nice, it was the, what do you call those courses? Udemy of the day. You just took a course, or Coursera or whatever online courses you have, and nice way to pass the time. No, she studied to learn, but a disciple studied to be like their master. A disciple studied to also disciple others. Now, you might argue to disciple other women. Fine, if you want to go there, doesn't matter. She was studying she was being discipled to disciple others. That's leadership, you see. And it wasn't going to be taken away from her, Yahshua says. She's chosen the most important thing, and it's not going to be taken away from her. What's she doing? Well, what it says in 1 Timothy 2. She's learning in quietness. She's becoming a disciple, mantaneto, right? In leisure, no? Okay. So what's going on then as far as this thing about not, he's clarifying though, right? He's saying in the assembly, I'm not saying that women should teach men or try to dictate that. I love that translation. I'm not saying women should teach men. In other words, now be careful, don't misunderstand this, right? I'm not saying women should teach men or try to dictate to them, rather that they should be left undisturbed. He's saying to them, do this and study, but don't think that that gives you now the right to then have authority over men in the public worship or in the teaching, right? So what is he saying? Well, perhaps this is a prohibition on what we call in our present day pulpit ministry, right? Maybe to be an active pastor or to be, an elder or something of that nature. And even that is disputed. I could tell you right now that the N.T. Wright, he's part of the Anglican Church, and they ordain women. I'm not there yet. I'm not so sure I can agree with that, right? But is it possible? It's possible. I haven't seen any record of it actually happening in the scriptures. So there are reasons why I'm not entirely comfortable with that interpretation. Deacon positions, we did see that there were deacons, right? That at least one, Phoebe was a deacon. But deacon positions didn't carry what you might consider ruling authority, such as an apostle, a pastor, or elder. So, that's something for me to study some more and to see the reasons why he believes that it's okay to ordain. Because he unequivocal. They've asked him, and the one guy asked him, he said, I see a lot of his stuff. And the one guy asked him, so you, let me make sure I'm understanding. So on balance, you believe that women are able to be ordained and teach and all that. And he says, everything except the on balance part. Let's just get rid of that part. Yeah. For him, there's no question about it. But the certain thing that is saying is that women should not usurp or take authority from men in terms of the context of the leadership, the plan that Yahweh has. And the possibility is that dealing only with things like husband and wife relationships or just in the context of worship? It's not entirely clear from the text. And part of the problem with all this is there are a wide variety of meanings for a number of Greek terms. And until Yahshua returns, we're just never going to know that for sure. But we know that he's talking about not usurping or taking authority from men for sure, right? So one possible interpretation is what I was mentioning earlier, that this is written in the context of people's knowledge of the cult of Artemis at Ephesus. It's like I said, it was a female-only cult. It was female-driven, female priestesses, and Paul is possibly opposing the idea based on the pagan background of a number of the women that the women shouldn't expect to take over the leadership from the men, because they would have known that in the cult of Artemis it was being done. Say, if it's good enough for the cult of Artemis, must be good here too. No, that's not how this works. That's not how it works in Yahweh's created order. And then he caps it off with a passage that is notoriously difficult for scholars to translate. So I promise you that Carlos Del Toro is not going to resolve that controversy today, right? But verses 13 to 15, I'll read it from this translation. Adam was created first, you see, and then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and fell into trespass. She will, however, be kept safe through the process of childbirth if she continues in faith, love, and holiness with prudence. So the way that most scholars are agreed with this passage is that it's actually more of a reflection on Adam and his failure than it is on the woman. In other words, what it's saying is that Adam, whereas Eve fell because she was deceived by the serpent, Adam deliberately fell because he knew better. And always, again, the context, right? He knew better. How did he know better? Because Yahweh told him, because Yahweh instructed him. What was Adam's job to do? To instruct her. As Adam was discipled by Yahweh, he should have then instructed her and discipled her. So the context leads us to believe that he failed in that job because she was deceived. How are you deceived unless you don't know what it is that you're supposed to be looking out for? So the implication is the knock on Adam, not on her. So a lot of men who want to be chauvinistic look at this and say, look, Eve was deceived, right? She's the one that was weak and fell apart, and Adam just kind of followed suit. No. You got it all wrong. It's the other way around. Adam had the primary responsibility as the person who's supposed to protect her. And we'll see that a little more in one of the other verses. He was the one who's supposed to teach her and protect her and give her the knowledge, and he failed in that. So therefore, she got more pain in childbearing, and that's Adam's fault. So she's going to continue doing that because until Yahshua returns, she's going to continue to give childbirth, and she'll continue to go in pain. But if she just kind of accepts that and goes on, eventually that wrong will be righted with new creation. Okay. So it's not a knock about childbirth. It's not, limiting her to just doing childbirth and everything else of consequence need not apply. No, has nothing to do with that. But the implication in the context is that the reason she's learning, he's like justifying why he believes that women should be learning and being discipled, because disaster befell a woman in the very beginning because she didn't have that discipling that she needed. So now she's going to get the discipling that she needs, except that she needs to do it in the context in which she's not going to expect that gives her then the right to exercise authority over men in contradiction to Yahweh's created order. Does everyone see that? Okay. So that's my explanation for that text. Now, I'm actually going to, because I'm really way over time here, and I'm going to wrap this up fairly quickly, but we can always return to it if we need to. So the two verses I was going to do was Titus 2, 3-5. Let's at least read it. Titus 2, 3-5. Yeah, I can believe that for sure. Oh, I'm sure that this is a side comment, that there are some men that if they heard this message, they would be very, very unhappy with me. To which I say, okay. Titus 2, verse 3. Likewise, teach the older women to be reverent in the way they live, not to be slanderers or addicted to much wine, but to teach what is good. So it's about behavior, right? Then they can urge the younger women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled and pure, to be busy at home, to be kind, and to be subject to their husbands. That subject to the husbands, we're not even going to touch it today, right? And to be honest, if you understand and accept that order that Yahweh has given, as I described it earlier, that should not be a point of contention, because subjection does not equal inferiority. Subjection does not equal. Why is subjection a dirty word? It's a dirty word because our culture, our secular culture, has made it so. Because they point to something without understanding it, they say, see, this is you being inferior. No, it has nothing whatsoever to do with you being inferior. Anymore, and I've explained this too in the context of work. If anyone ever told me that I'm inferior to my boss at work, I would laugh in their face. I'm not inferior to my boss at work. I have a job to do. There's an order. The order says you're a supervisor and I'm not. When I do my job well, it works out well for all of us, because a rising tide lifts all ships. So if my tide rises, it lifts my boss's ship and everyone around me and my own, right? I've been a supervisor maybe one time officially and a couple of times acting. And although that was nice, I promise you that the times I was not a supervisor were just as fulfilling and lucrative to me than being a supervisor. When the skin off my back to not have to not be a supervisor. I don't need that in order to be fulfilled. I'm part of a whole of an organization, and the entire organization does well, and we all look good. Why is that so hard to understand in the context of men and women relations? Why is it so hard to understand that men do certain things, that they are responsible for? Women do certain things that they are responsible for. We can argue about what things they're responsible for, right? But maybe argue is not a good word, right? We can debate, right? But why must we ultimately come to a point of contention? If we're supposed to supplement one another, why can we not agree that men do certain things that they have a more natural inclination for, and women do? And you know what? Some people view that as being sexist on my part. You know what? I don't care. It's just, I have thousands of years of recorded history to prove that that's the case, and scientific evidence to boot that we're wired differently. So you want to say what you want, say what you want. But we absolutely have to recognize that there are differences. And, and when everyone does their part, everybody, and I do mean everybody, benefits from that. Okay, so finishing this here. Then they can urge the younger women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled and pure, to be busy at home, to be kind, and to be subject to their husbands, so that no one will malign the word of Yahweh. And everyone seems to forget in the culture that ultimately that's what's the most important thing, so that no one will malign the word of Yahweh, which contains an order. And then it says, similarly, encourage the young men to be self-controlled. And then there's a whole slew of things for men to do, right? So no one's left untouched. We all have things that we're supposed to be doing. So that should be a point of contention is a reflection on us and not what Yahweh is asking us to do. And the last one, thank you for holding out. 1 Peter 3, verses 1-7. And there's only one thing I really want to explain from 1 Peter 3, 1-7, because it's fighting words for a lot of people. All right, let's be honest. 1 Peter 3, 1-7. I was just checking to make sure I didn't have another verse around there somewhere. Okay, 3:1-7. Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives. And by the way, isn't this kind of interesting? I mentioned I would say only one thing, but I just can't help myself. Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands. So look at the result of submitting herself to her own husband, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. So this is a situation where if a woman treats her man in such a way that she respects and honors him as in his role in the family, even the man who is spiritually deficient can be saved. I mean, just think about that for a second. Through the power that you have, right? So submission bringing power. We don't think of it that way. All we hear is the word submission. I'm not saying you, right? I'm just talking about the world. But all we hear is the word submission. We don't see the bigger picture here. Because of her quote unquote submission, maybe we could find a better word to describe it, so it wouldn't be so inflammatory. So because of her submission, she helps to save the life of her husband. That is powerful, because he will react to her like he will react to none other on this earth. If that isn't powerful, I don't know what is. We're seeing things differently. Your beauty should not come, this is similar stuff to what we saw before. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in Yahweh's sight. Same thing that Paul is saying. For this is the way the holy women of the past who put their hope in Yahweh used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her master. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. I like that. And do not give way to fear. Now, admittedly, men who read this wrong and other passages cause fear. Is that a problem of Yahweh's system? Is that a problem of Yahweh's text? Or is that a problem of the moronic man who twists something that shouldn't be twisted? I'm sorry, but I'm being blunt here, because there are a lot of men out there who behave like morons, and they treat their women badly, and they use the scripture to justify it. And I have a serious problem with that, in case you haven't noticed. So if we do things the right way, it leads to doing what is right, and it leads to no fear. And that's a beautiful thing. But then it says, husbands, we're not done with the fighting words yet. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives. Okay, so let's ignore that, and let's just go to this weaker vessel thing, right? Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives. Be considerate and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Okay, let's just break this down a little bit. And let's take a look at another translation as well. Some things say weaker partner. I've never seen it as weaker partner, like in the NIV. Most versions I've seen say weaker vessel, right? That's probably how you've seen it as well. So here in the New Kingdom, the Kingdom translation, it says, you men in the same way think out how to live with your wives. Yes, they are physically weaker than you, but they deserve full respect. They are heirs of the grace of life just the same as you. That way, nothing will obstruct your prayers. So his translation emphasizes the physical weakness part of it. And by the way, a lot of scholars would agree with that term weaker vessel, but it's not necessarily just weakness in terms of a physical weakness. It's describing something like it's more like a delicate vessel. In other words, it's something that is described almost like you would describe a precious vase that's delicate, and that if you don't treat it right, the context, be considerate with your wives as you live with them and treat them with respect as a weaker partner, a weaker vessel, in the sense of being something delicate that needs protection. So you have men who are ham-handed, right, and treat their women roughly, either physically or emotionally, and then they destroy the women physically, or they destroy them in their psyche, so to speak, right? And what he's supposed to be doing instead is recognizing, and by the way, remember, we can debate whether you think a woman is physically weaker. To me, anyone who can deliver a baby, all right, I don't know that I'd call that physically weak. So Paul, if I were back there, I don't know that I would say that, right? But his emphasis is not on that. In that culture, and it can be proven scientifically that on average, please hear me, on average, women are physically not as strong as men are. Now, in terms of things like childbearing and in terms of other, right? So we can debate that, right? Because I'm saying it and I don't know that I even believe it as I say it, right? But physically, in terms of body mass and the like, this is a part of the debate, even in our current culture, with regard to transgender issues, right? Where you're talking about women who become men who want to participate in men's sports. And the debate within the sports world is whether they should allow that because of the inequities in physical strength. It's just the physical reality that we live with, that on average, women are physically, in terms of their body mass or whatever, they're physically less, they're not as strong as men are. So the main message here is not emphasizing the physical weakness of the women. Certainly not talking about emotional weakness or spiritual weakness, right? The emphasis is not on that. It's the main point of this is for a man to treat his woman right, to treat his woman with respect, with dignity, to protect her as he would a precious vase. So far from viewing a woman as having little intrinsic value, it's the exact opposite. It's essentially saying your woman is like something precious that you're supposed to protect and treat her like a beautiful treasure. And guess what? When you do that, you're treating her as an heir with you, in other words, a co-heir with you of the gracious gift of life, as an equal. You're treating her as an heir along with you so that nothing will hinder your prayers. So your prayers can be hindered by treating, by treating yourself, your wife, like, in a way that's inappropriate. So, every single one of these verses that we have, that our culture has twisted, there are the actual intent of these passages is so different from what people will put out there in the popular culture to poison people's minds with. And I'd like for us to, elevate our thinking to get past the cultural noise and to get back to the purity of what Yahweh's word actually says, to recognize that certain things are cultural in nature. Certain things meant something back then that because of 2,000 years, my friends, of history are going to look a little different to us today. It's inevitable, right? But we have to take those in the proper context in which we find them so that we see what is the main point of each one of these passages. And I just kind of scratched the surface of each of these. But I hope this has been a little bit helpful for you to frame these things and to think of them in a different way than perhaps you might have thought about it before. So thank you so much for being patient with me as I went overtime today, and I will stop there.